Stephen Leahy says that the shortage of water is the biggest challenge the global economy faces. Stephen Leahy knows a lot about water, and not just liquid water like the water you see behind me, the 100 gallons of water that a North American uses every day for drinking, washing, and flushing. He's talking about the water that we use and never even see. His recent book is Your Water Footprint, the shocking facts about how much water we use to make everyday products. It turns out that the average American actually uses 2,000 gallons a day, and most of it is embedded in our food. A farmer uses 400 gallons to produce a pound of rice, more than 2,000 gallons for a pound of butter, and as much as 5,000 gallons for a pound of beef. But it's not just our food. Manufacturing a cell phone uses 240 gallons of water. A cotton shirt contains 660 gallons of virtual water. Only about 3% of the world's water is drinkable, and we're using more and more of it every year. The resulting shortages cause drought, food shortages, economic contraction, and mass migration. Stephen Leahy is also unique in the way he goes about the practice of journalism. He's written for National Geographic, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Audubon, Maclean's Magazine, and many other outlets, but the coverage of environmental stories in North America's mainstream media has dropped sharply over the last few years. So Leahy invented community-supported environmental journalism, where his readers support him directly by subscribing to his work online at www.stephenleahy.net. Their reward is excellent reporting and interpretation. This book just won the Best Science Book Award at the Green Books Festival in New York.
Water that comes out of our tap is obviously something we're familiar with on a daily basis. But virtual water is the water it takes to make things. So for instance, to make this shirt takes about 5,000 liters of water. So what does this water involve? It involves the water it took to grow the cotton and then to process the cotton. So it's real water. You can't make a shirt without it, but we don't see it. So that's the term, it's come to be called either virtual water, or I use the word hidden, because really we don't see it.
Yeah. And it's a huge amount, right? And for a lot of for domestic products that you wouldn't think so.
Yeah, the amounts are staggering. Like a cup of coffee takes 140 liters of water to make one cup. Yeah. And where's that water? That water is for growing the coffee beans. For one cup of coffee requires 140 liters of water. A cell phone, 1,000 liters for one cell phone. So that's the water to make all of the elements in a cell phone.
And where does water enter into the components of a cell phone?
So to make the glass, it's made of silica, so the process of both mining and refining the materials, the metals, all require water. I mean, we need water to make anything. I ask kids sometimes in schools, can you think of something that doesn't need water to make? And no one yet has come up with one.
Okay. So now when you talk about our water footprint, which is the second kind of term I wanted to discuss a little bit, tell me about that.
Well, it's like the carbon footprint. So the water footprint is the amount of water we use on a daily basis, both direct use for cooking and washing, and this virtual water in our products. So in our food and in the things we use every day, our clothing, our cars, our electricity, all of these items are things that require water. And so in order to get an understanding of how much water we use each day, this concept of footprint, water footprint, has developed, say, in the last 20 years to give us a better sense of how much water we actually use.
Is that the part of the whole concept of an ecological footprint?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's one of the elements. So if you're going to do an ecological footprint, you need to look at both carbon and water and other.
Yeah, because I think when we've done some interviews about ecological footprints, particularly with Bill Rees,
mm-hmm.
and I think it's thought of largely as what you require in terms of the area required to grow your food and to absorb your waste or something of that kind. But I hadn't thought of water as being a part.
Yeah, and it's obviously a similar concept. The products are manufactured, of course, in different countries. So it means we're using the water in these other countries for our goods and foods that we consume. So I think it's a very useful concept because it gives us a picture of how the world actually functions. So in global trade, there are these tremendous rivers of water flowing from one country to another in the form of goods and foods. So I think it's a key concept for us to really understand what's happening on our planet.
You've said that actually the global trade can be regarded as rivers of water flowing in one direction and money in the other. I don't think I'm paraphrasing that exactly right, but
yeah.
But tell me about that. Because
well, there's a lot of countries that are well off financially, or relatively speaking. So in the Middle East, they can't grow their own food, and they don't have enough water to produce most of their goods, so they have to import. So that means they're importing all of this virtual water from other countries in exchange for cash. And that can make sense, you know, if this trade is done on a sustainable basis, if the water use is sustainable, where it's being, where things are being manufactured, because otherwise very few people would be able to live in the Middle East, because they're not self-sufficient, they can't be self-sufficient because there simply isn't enough water.
But they used to be.
Yeah, when they had a different lifestyle. Lifestyles make a huge difference. If you have a simpler lifestyle, less materialistic, so you don't need the water to make all of these products. So if you just use your water for drinking and for growing some of your own food, with a relatively small population, yes, you can certainly get by in a dry climate.
Yeah, as they did for many
thousands of years, yeah.
But then also there's a degradation built into that whole situation too, right?
Yeah, so water gets polluted. Water, if it's not sort of cared for, ends up being unusable for drinking or cooking or making stuff, and that's a huge problem. There's always been this issue for large parts of the world where they figure, well, we'll just get the water somewhere else. We either get the water somewhere else or we'll get the products from somebody else. So we will import our fruits and vegetables from another place.
As we do here in Nova Scotia from California to a large extent, and from Mexico, which may be a trade that's really endangered, right?
Yeah, well, the droughts in California are definitely having an impact on their production. The fruits, vegetables, but also dairy and meat. It's a huge dairy and meat producer as well in California, and their productions are going down. They have to shift their crops away from these water-intensive crops that they've been focused on, dairy in particular, to crops that need a lot less water, because their water shortage is not only chronic, it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, and probably it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
Tell me about Saudi Arabia, because I think that's an interesting, you mentioned it in the book, and I think there's an interesting sort of history there for this.
You know, Saudi Arabia had had a large aquifer, so an underground water source. Now this was fossil water. This is water that's thousands of years old, because after all, Saudi Arabia is basically all desert. But from thousands of years ago, enough water accumulated under the ground for this giant aquifer. And so Saudi Arabia could drill wells and pump up water and grow food. And they had actually had a target of being self-sufficient in food production. As their population grew and their cities expanded, they were getting close to it, and they were even one time thinking of exporting crops. But a few years ago, they realized that their aquifer is nearly empty. And so now they're suffering water shortages, and they've really cut back on their food production. And so instead, they're buying land in places like Africa to grow food for their own purposes. So in fact, they are buying land in Africa, but they're also buying the water, because land without water is pretty useless for producing food.
Actually, land without water is pretty useless, right?
Yeah, generally speaking, we call them deserts and or wastelands for a reason.
Yeah, well, you can't grow lumber there. Nothing's going to
grow. Yeah.
How did they, this sounds like a very rational response on the part of the Saudis. It sounds as though they figured this situation out and took some action. How did that happen? Because I don't think that's common, is it?
Well, I think it's looking down the line at your future. You know, where are we going to get food from, and are we going to be held hostage to, say, countries willing to sell us food at premium prices because they know we're well off? Can we get the kind of crops that our foods that we want to eat? So it's a form of control, so that you can control what is being grown on the land that you have leased. Generally speaking, 99-year leases in Africa. That I think a larger measure of control. They're not the only countries doing it. China also owns a lot of land, millions and millions of hectares outside of their own country.
I guess the thing that interests me is that that's not what's happening in other places with similar problems. Let me put this in maybe the baldest and rudest kind of way. It sounds to me like an authoritarian country is better able to cope with this kind of issue than democratic countries with 4-year election cycles.
Yeah, I think that's generally true because in authoritarians, countries, they see themselves as being in power forever, effectively, so they look a little more long-term. And since most of the big challenges we face are long-term challenges, it's kind of given them an advantage. So for instance, China wants to build 100 eco-cities, not just so they can clean up their own air, but so they can sell the technology to the rest of us, because they know we're going to need it. So yeah, that long-term thinking is, I think, a real plus for some countries.
Yeah, well, and then of course it raises, and I want to come back to this, but it raises the question of how democracies can deal with this kind of issue, which actually takes me around to Denmark. I noticed that from the book that Denmark is water stressed, and the Danes are usually extremely intelligent at dealing with these kinds of issues and at looking long term. So what's happening there?
Well, they've put a lot of their economy into production of certain foodstuffs like pork, and pork ends up creating a lot of pollution problems. So they've got this issue of we've set our economic goals on this fairly high value product within Europe of producing lots and lots of pork, and we're good at it, but the downside is they're getting a lot of water pollution problems. At the same time, they're also getting a lot of floods, and this is kind of making a havoc of this is a climate change impact that's really affecting their decision making, so they're not quite sure which way to turn now on this. But in terms of a long-term planning, a country that does it really well is Germany. So when I was in Germany recently, I talked to representatives from different political parties about their future in terms of energy, this energy where they want to move to green energy sources. And I talked to the Green Party and then the ultra-conservative party, and they all say the same thing. They're all singing from the same songbook, because they see this is the future for Germany. This is what, again, a technology we can develop in Germany and then sell to the rest of the world. And I asked them, I said, well, how is it you can agree with people from such different ideological backgrounds? And they said, well, we don't agree on all the details of how this is going to be done and what the timing would be. But we certainly agree on the direction, and we know if we don't cooperate, we can never move in that direction. We cannot seize or benefit from the fruits of our decisions to create this new green economy unless we cooperate. And essentially they said, how else can you get things done if you completely reject what the other party proposes?
So of course that's exactly what happens in most Western democracies.
Yeah. So it's they think we're in North America in particular in a paralysis situation that is, they think, kind of confusing and nonsensical, really. They just can't understand how we can allow our systems to devolve to that level. Of course, they didn't used to work that way. There was cooperation amongst parties 20 years ago. And they truly can't understand how we expect to do well in a global society when we are bickering amongst ourselves all the time.
Well, and also, we're also refusing to accept the findings of science, which I would think a German would find incomprehensible, right?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they, again, don't understand why you have scientists. Why do we have science if we're never going to believe the evidence that they provide? Yeah, it just mystifies them.
And that sort of contributes to something, another term of yours that I wanted to talk about a little bit, and that was a water bubble, right? Tell me about a water bubble, because we seem to have a water bubble big time in North America, right?
Yeah, so California is probably the best example right now. So they are using more water than they actually have, and they've been shipping water for nearly 80 years from other places outside the state into the water. So they are essentially consuming enormous volumes of water well beyond their own capacity, certainly beyond a renewable capacity. And you can only do this so long before this water bubble bursts. It's just like the housing bubble. You keep increasing the consumption of water when there's actually a finite amount of water available, and sooner or later you're going to have problems. And that's certainly true in California, where people now, some small communities have no water at all. They have to go to neighboring communities to get it. A lot of agriculture is being curtailed because of their water shortages. And even at the household level, people are being told to ration their water use. And it's not going to be temporary. This is going to be permanent.
How do you see that coming out? I mean, how do you, as the future unfolds and they're in this bubble situation, how will the bubble actually burst? I guess that's what it's going to be like to be a Californian as the bubble goes away.
Well, there'll be increasing restrictions. There'll be farmers who can't get enough water, and their response at the moment is to pump groundwater. And in California, there's no rules on pumping groundwater. Anybody can sink a well and pump as much water as they like. Probably one of the few places in North America that actually allows that. And there's going to be laws about that to change that. That's inevitable, because there would be people who feel that their neighbor's taking all the water that's from underneath their property. So it'll get messy. There'll be lots of protests, and then there will be a requirement of governments to step in. A lot of California homes don't have water meters. So those are things that need to change and will change. So there's going to be a lot of stress on people in California. And their economy is going to suffer. And maybe even things like, well, certainly the cost of water is going to go up. So that's some of the ways in which it will manifest itself. Their agricultural production will go down. There is talk of some major crisis. I don't see any kind of big crisis coming. It's more of like a little mini crisis. Slowly the water bubble will probably more deflate than burst.
It's an ideal example of and you almost said this a moment ago, but I wanted to just tease that out too, of the danger of having infinite growth in a finite situation. And and I think many of us have grasped that in the abstract, but this is a really nice specific example, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's there is not that hard actually now to work out the carrying capacity when it comes to water for a region. So, and in fact, the researchers at the Pacific Institute have figured out how much water California could consume on a sustainable basis. And I can't remember the number offhand, but it's substantially less than they are currently consuming. So we can actually work out carrying capacities, what's a sustainable level of water use. But that's never factored in any decisions about growth or economics or business plans or government policies. And that's one of the things that's going to have to change.
Yeah, I was going to say it's about to get factored into it, like it or not, right?
Yeah, it's the law of nature, if you will. It's going to happen. It'd be better to approach it in an orderly way, but now it's not going to be that way. It'll be more chaotic, of lurching from one disaster to another.
Mm-hmm. Is this also another example of the tragedy of the commons, where the thing that's owned in common is exploited beyond its...
To a certain extent it is, but it's more, I think, of this lack of long-term vision and understanding of how our planet actually works, that it is a finite system, and what does that mean? I mean, a lot of just people, as you said, conceptually get that, but in practice, we don't apply it. We pretend it's an infinite planet. And so that's a big reason why we're in the mess we're in.
For a long time, I lived in rural Cape Breton Island, where we had tons of rain, and the water was coming from my well, and I would think to myself, if I employ a low-flow shower head, is there any point in it? You know, what do you say to that sort of situation?
Well, the one thing about virtual water and water consumption is, yeah, some places you can consume a lot of water without any harm. It's really more connected, again, to the sort of carrying capacity or sustainability. So in your case in Cape Breton, sure, it doesn't make any sense necessarily to have a low-flow shower head. Assuming this is going to be the situation for the future, is this always going to be a rainy place? I don't know. I mean, we are in an era of climate change, so things are going to be different.
I thought what you were going to say was that to think that the water that I was using directly, the real water I was using directly, was anything much to do with my water footprint would be actually erroneous, wouldn't it? I mean,
that's true. It's it sort of works out that the average person in North America's water footprint's about 8,000 liters per day per person. Of that, 300 to 400 liters is the direct use. So that's the toilets, the showers, the cooking, the washing. The rest of it is the virtual water.
Now, tell me about that. So if I'm going through my day, I'm obviously going to buy a shirt, but that's got a huge amount of water in it, right?
Yeah.
And what are some of the other products that are really heavy, really represent a heavy consumption of water?
Well, again, to stick with clothing, like a pair of shoes, 10 to 12,000 liters. Jeans, 7,000, 8,000 for a pair of jeans. Flat screen TV, 200,000 liters, depending on how big it is. A book, this little book here is probably 1,000 liters for one copy. Virtually anything you think of. Cars, of course, use fuel. Fuel requires water to get it out of the ground. A plastic water bottle, so a half-liter plastic water bottle, it takes 5 liters of water to make the plastic for that bottle, which is a bit ironic. So every time you drink a half-liter water bottle, you're drinking, actually, or you're consuming 5.5 liters.
Yeah, I think you also had some specific suggestions about ways to reduce, and I guess what we're talking about here is reducing your remote water use, right?
Yeah.
And so your direct water is not really that nearly as great a concern as your consumption of other things.
Yeah, and that relates to generally consumption, period, consumption of material goods. So on the food side, so of the virtual water, about half of that water footprint is for food. And about 40% of all food in North America is wasted. So that means all the water to produce that food is also being wasted. So cutting down on food waste is a big way to reduce your water footprint. For the material goods, the clothing, the products, again, reduce, reuse, recycle are really good ways in which to reduce that. So for instance, a lot of my clothes I buy at a thrift store. So I'm reusing clothes to keep the water in effect, in circulation, as opposed to having to buy a new pair, which is going to require, new water to be used to produce those clothing. Same thing with electronic goods. Up until very, very recently, had never bought a television. We just inherited televisions from relatives. So those are, that reduce, reuse, recycle is key. The sort of final point is about our consumption of material goods in general. I mean, let's face it, we've all got homes full of stuff we don't actually use anymore, and it took water to make all of that stuff. So when you're looking at a buying decision, I think the really important question to ask is, do you really need it? Do I really need this? Or is it something that would be nice to have or that I just want? I think if we ask that question, do I really need it, we would cut down on our water consumption and our material consumption in general, both of which are things that need to happen, as the world grows, as the population continues to grow, and resources are becoming fewer and fewer.
Yeah, and as you, it seems to me there's a shift that's needed to durability here, so that, you know, you buy a car that lasts you 20, 30, 40 years, not 4 or 5 years, right? That kind of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a pair of shoes that was a good pair of shoes. You know, they're probably 16, 17 years old, and they're fine. I mean, they've been repaired a couple of times, and they're good for another 10 years. So I think that durability is really important. You know, buy for things that will last. Buy good things that you like and that will last. So, you know, things like fast fashion is definitely the wrong trend.
And this presumably is how population levels and income combined are doing us in as far as water is concerned, right?
Yeah, so you get the fast rising incomes of Asia, for instance, who are adopting a consumer lifestyle, meaning they're buying more and more stuff, and that's a, you know, that cannot continue from a water perspective or from other material perspectives. So the sooner that we can shift all of us from this consumption lifestyle, the better for the planet and the better for all of us, truthfully, as well.
How do you do that?
It's just by deciding.
A small question.
A small question. I think at an individual level, and I think just talking amongst your friends and neighbors about, you know, stuff that do we really need this stuff? Let's have a, you know, what are the things that really make us happy in life? It's relationships, being with friends. It's not things. And I think the more we have conversations about that, you know, because there's a lot of folks who are not, say, enjoying their life as much as they would like, and so they feel hard pressed to continue to acquire stuff, which keeps them locked into jobs they don't like, and that just ends up making people unhappy. So, you know, what is it that really makes us happy? I think more conversations about that around the kitchen table would help a lot.
But it is an uphill battle against an entire system that's geared to planned obsolescence and continuous economic growth and so forth, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and a advertising industry that spends, I don't know, I forget what the number is now, a number of billions of dollars every year to persuade people to buy stuff they don't need. And a very sophisticated industry, I'll have to say. But I think also people are beginning to realize through things like the wacky weather we're having as a result of climate change, that we're going down the wrong path, that things do need to change. And I think what folks need assistance with is, you know, what changes would be better? What changes will improve my life and benefit future generations? And so I think there is definitely an opening, just fairly recently now, that people are more willing to talk about these things, more willing to say, yeah, we need to do things differently.
Mm. And there's also the whole, I think, fairly new phenomenon of people openly being burdened by stuff.
Yeah.
You know, like you see a show like Storage Wars, and that tells you something really.
Yeah, it's kind of an obscenity, that. And storage sites proliferate all around North America. I actually had something in the draft of the book, whatever there was, 70,000 storage sites or something, and it amounted to an enormous amount of square footage just to put stuff we can't cram into our homes.
Into our ever larger homes.
Yeah, and yet, 100 years ago, people were very happy with, you know, 2 or 3 outfits of clothing, and that was it.
You see that when you go into old homes and you look at the closets. You know, some of the old homes in Cape Breton, the closet is 18 inches deep, and the clothes are oriented sideways, so there's kind of like 2 little rods, and there's enough for 5 shirts and a jacket, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we all have closets full of clothes, which amounts to millions of liters of water, that we don't even wear anymore and have forgotten. So, yeah, I mean, recycle those clothes, take them down to the thrift store, and stop buying new ones. Buy good pairs of good stuff, durable goods, and then keep them. I think, and it's a lot less stressful in terms of having to shop and having to think about what should I be wearing, what shouldn't I be wearing. if this is all you have, then the decision is very easy in the morning.
Yes, it's not going to cost you a lot of time to say, I have 3 shirts. You know, if I don't wear this one, I've only got 2 choices. Yeah, that's what. You've also noted that farmland is being abandoned because of water issues. Tell me about some examples of that.
Yeah, so it's an increasing phenomenon as places have been using, say, irrigation and pumping water from underground. What happens is land gets salty because the deeper you pump the water from, it often has lots of minerals in it. And that ends up on the soil, and the soil then becomes too toxic to actually grow plants, and that forces farmers and people to move on. The other part of water shortages is that the land can no longer produce food at all because either there's a shift in rainfall or the wells have run dry. And that creates this phenomena that we've seen a lot more in the news lately of migration. People have to move. It's either put up your feet and die of hunger or thirst, or move somewhere else. So these migrants who are moving, say, out of Africa to Europe, they don't have any choice. You could argue that these are, in fact, climate change migrants because the climate is changing in large parts of Africa as it is elsewhere.
And so you're leaving behind you basically toxic land, but you then presumably have more and more people on what is in effect a shrinking land base, right?
Yeah.
Which is a death spiral, isn't it?
Well, it's definitely the wrong way to go, both between this soil degradation and increasing population and urban areas taking up more land. It's producing food gets to be more challenging. However, at the same time, there are ways in which to produce food that are much more sustainable. They call it polyculture, so several crops being grown together and they work together to fend off pests. And there's several studies in places like Africa where these systems, which are based on traditional systems, produce a lot more food. They don't produce necessarily much more corn per hectare, but they produce more tonnage of food per hectare. So you get a variety of crops, which is good in a changing climate when you don't know what the weather's going to bring. It's a lot more flexible system. So it's possible to continue to feed people, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that there's no more land on the planet. We need to preserve a fair amount of our planet for nature as well, because nature also provides all these services like oxygen and other key important things. And nature needs water too, so we can't take all the water because again, we need nature services for us to survive.
Is there any way to bring back farmland that's been rendered too salty to?
Yeah, it often takes a lot of water, so you got to sort of flush the soil. Another way, which is more time intensive, is to increase the fertility of the soil with organic matter. But this is a fairly lengthy thing, but it is done in places. I did a story about Carlos Crovetto, the soil maker of Chile, who made all this soil, several inches of topsoil, in a completely devastated landscape that he bought cheap, obviously, and is one of the more successful farmers in Chile now. So he did his own ways of increasing the fertility with compost and manure, and over time managed to bring back his soil. And of course, it was a dry area, but with this extra compost and manure and this richness of the soil, it now holds the moisture better. So even though maybe some of the neighboring farmers are not doing so well during a drought, he's still producing food because this rich layer of topsoil holds water like a sponge.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking as I asked the question of I think it was the Hohokam people in the southwestern states that were great irrigators and ultimately disappeared because the irrigation actually demolished their soil.
Yeah, there's a lot of lessons in history that we've failed to pay attention to. It's a fairly common problem. A lot of the Middle East has the same problems as well.
Well, that's right. The Fertile Crescent
Yeah,
is desert now, right?
yeah, it's desert now. Yeah.
Which is
Yeah, we've
another-
turned a lot of land into desert. A lot of the Earth's deserts are not, they're human caused, not, they weren't there originally.
I don't think that's widely known.
No, no it isn't, no.
So how do we, maybe that brings us to another question, which is all right, we you know, a certain number of people do understand these kinds of things, but how do you make that more broadly understood? How do you get these?
Well, I think in schools, it's important to start in schools to teach kids. I mean, they're really interested in stuff like this. You know, essentially teaching them how their planet actually works. I mean, not very many people understand that, and it's not that complicated. And yet, very few of our leaders, either in business or in politics, have a clue how the planet actually functions. Which, you know, it's like having a pilot who's never flown a plane before, you know, take all us passengers for a ride. So, you know, those are education is, I think, a key component. Also, you know, films like this, I think, will help. The media can certainly do a lot more on that respect. And, you know, there's been a big shift away from for-profit media to non-profit media, who are actually doing a much better job of informing people about what's really going on and the things that we need to do. So, yeah, those are a couple ideas.
As you spoke, I was thinking to myself, I wonder what it would look like if you went at the curriculum and said the key discipline is ecology, an understanding of the life systems of the planet, and then you structured every individual subject area around that, so that, for example, in history, you're not learning about battles and kings, you're learning about the Hohokam, or you're learning about Easter Island, or you're learning about, you know, and so history becomes something that's much more interesting because it really applies to the situations you face today. It's an attempt to learn some lessons from the past. And the same thing with geography, and the same thing with literature, and, you know, there would be, I can imagine a whole curriculum being structured around that.
Yeah, and it makes sense because that's in fact how indigenous people, you know, traditional people taught their youth. You know, they told them stories about what happened, but it was also about the connection to the land and all the stories, of course, because the land is part of who they are, and that's something we've lost. We need to understand that nature is who we are, and certainly we need to understand what that means, especially now in a modern context, because we've certainly lost that.
Yeah, and particularly for urban people who don't see much of nature at all in the course of their normal
No. No, and yet there's still a lot of nature around here, and I'm sure and even in any city has lots of wildlife if you know to look for it.
Yes, that's right. But we aren't telling those stories to our kids in the same way.
No.
Right? Yeah. So that all brings me to the question of the media, because one of the things, part of the reason that we're having this conversation is because we're both members of the Society of Environmental Journalists. And on the Canadian listserv of the SEJ, there was a question at one point about who is on the environmental beat at various major mainstream media, the Globe and Mail, CBC, all that kind of thing. And somebody said, I think that Stephen Leahy is almost the only environmental journalist left functioning in the country, and he's doing it on his own basis. So two questions. First, what is the state generally of this kind of reporting across the country from your perspective? And then second, tell me about your solution, your own resolution for your own work.
Yeah, so the mainstream media has pretty well abandoned the environment beat, and it sees it as unnecessary, I suppose, despite the fact that, you know, environment is just another word for the planet Earth. I mean, that's what the coverage is about, what's going on planet Earth. And that's something that's happened over the more than 20 years I've been freelancing. And so my solution was, I know that these are important stories, and I get lots of feedback from people saying, wow, I didn't know that, I've never seen this information before, it's really important, I've shared it with all my friends. So if people are interested, and I want to continue to do it, and I think it's important for our society, because we have big challenges ahead and we need to understand what's going on. How can I continue to do it and make a living if mainstream media is not interested in paying for these kinds of stories? So I went directly to the public and asked them for donations to support my work so I can continue to cover these, again, these really important issues that we're going to have to make some serious decisions about. Otherwise we're going to be, as I said before, lurching from crisis to crisis.
Someone watching this wants to participate in this. How do they find you?
Well, I've got a website. There's hundreds of stories, and my stories are on there, covering a wide range of environmental issues from a whole bunch of countries, so people can reach me through that.
I was going to say, we don't often do a commercial, but this is one where it's really worthwhile doing that, and I hope it prompts some people to actually do this. I was also thinking about the question of why the mainstream media has abandoned this, because it seems to me that we did have some pretty good environmental reporting and environmental journalism going on a couple of decades back, and how, as the problem has become more intense, has the coverage become so much less?
It's a very good question. The answer I get when I ask editors, they say, well, the management of the media outlets say that there's no interest from the public. And so I always encourage people to write letters to these publications to say, no, we want to know what's going on in the world. Canadians are actually fairly poorly informed, compared to Europeans who still have very strong environmental coverage. Truly, Canada is well behind in the Canadian public generally. And as a result, I don't know how many people in Canada tell me, oh, I saw your story in The Guardian. So I write about environmental stuff, often about Canadian environmental issues, for The Guardian in the UK. And they asked me to cover Canada for them because they saw there's so little coverage by media here in Canada.
That's staggering, isn't it? And on what basis do the owners conclude that there's no interest? Because your experience has been exactly the opposite, right? I mean, even when you ran as a Green candidate, went door to door, and people said,
yeah, people said, wow, this is great stuff you're talking about. I've never heard of this before. These issues, what's going on, what's really happening, say, with the tar sands, with the pipeline issues, those kinds of things. It's like, oh, I didn't realize, all this water is being contaminated in the tar sands. I didn't realize this, or didn't realize that. It happened time and time again. And on the international level, which I cover as well, Canada's been playing a spoiler role, basically refusing to participate in many important international environmental agreements. Around the world, we are not very popular. There are times at these big UN meetings where folks are quite angry with me because I'm usually one of the few Canadians there, and saying, what's going on in your country? Why are you people doing this? We know Canadians are not like this. Why is your government acting in such a negative way? But Canadians, general public, don't know this is going on.
We interviewed George Monbiot a while back, and Monbiot commented on the astonishing spectacle of seeing an intelligently run and quite humane polity turn into what he called a thuggish petro-state.
Yeah, that certainly is an apt description of what's happened. Yeah.
And Canadians don't know this, I don't think. They don't know that they don't know that our image has changed. They don't know they should take the maple leaf off their backpacks when they go abroad.
Yeah, when my son was traveling through Central America, I advised him to make sure you do not display the maple leaf anywhere, because throughout Central and South America, Canadian mining companies have a very bad reputation for human rights abuses.
So tell me again, I think with respect to your own journalism, how difficult has it been to actually make that conversion, and how well has that gone for you? From being the usual kind of freelancer selling to magazines that then pay you, to being one who's supported by the crowd as well as by a market of some kind. And the market's an interesting question too, like who is it that is buying the work?
Yeah. So the crowdsourcing thing that I've been doing the last 6 years is certainly quite challenging. It requires an entrepreneurial approach to doing journalism. It takes a lot of time, but it has a lot of benefits because I have a relationship with my readers. And in some cases it becomes a personal, but there's some give and take. I have to explain my personal situation in terms of finances so that they understand this is money that I need to do this work, and also to understand the media landscape, that the media that are interested in these important environmental stories generally have very little money, or they're nonprofits. So they can't really pay me what I need to survive. So I need to supplement that with public donations. And people are very generous and when they can, and they're not only generous with their money, with their wallets, but with their time, and as well as sharing accommodations. If I need to stay in a place, there's a couch or a spare room in various cities around the world that I've been able to use, and that's been fabulous. And then I get to meet a whole bunch of really interesting people. So it's been a big plus, but it's quite different than the regular journalism. It's stressful because I don't have that. I live below the poverty line, and so we've had to make a lot of accommodations to, I don't own a car and that kind of thing, to reduce the amount of money that I need to survive. And my wife has been obviously a tremendous support in supporting my work as well as my kids. So that's been great.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned people around the world that you kind of couch surf with and so forth. You've actually become part of a network of journalists internationally who basically provide this kind of mutual assistance, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, it actually started in Germany, and it's a network of mostly freelancers who work both to support ourselves on a staying at somebody's house or getting contacts, but also sometimes to work on stories together from different perspectives, and then sharing our outlets. So in other words, if I say, oh, there's a really good editor in this magazine in the US, you should contact them for that story. So we've flipped the competition model on its head, and now it's all about it's collaboration. Most of these are young journalists, I'll say that, with the exception of ourselves, and they really understand this is the way forward. To solve all of the problems we have, we need cooperation and collaboration. We can't do it on our own, and competing against each other is just foolish. So it's been very inspiring, as well as rewarding, I think, for everybody involved. We learn from each other, we share, and I think that's going to be the new model of journalism.
That's fascinating. Give me an example of a story that's been worked on by several people. You mentioned that was one of the outcomes sometimes.
Yeah, so we were covering climate change. So one of the big UN climate meetings this one was in Warsaw a couple of years ago. And so there was a big storm in the Philippines, and so there was a Filipino reporter who was writing about it from her perspective. And I would do this science-y thing, what's the real climate science behind these increased storms? And then we had two others from Africa talking about, it's not just storms, it's increasing droughts or changes in when the rain falls that's affecting food production. So you have this sort of gamut of impacts, but from the ground, from people actually in these places writing about it. Yeah, I think it turned out a really good series of stories on that.
And where would they appear?
A variety of their local publications, because they're local publications, and then some international ones. So I write for international news service called IPS. And there was even an agreement with a couple of other news outlets that are new online ones, where we would share parts of stories with them in order to distribute this information much more broadly. And so we got picked up by some Italian newspapers, quite a few European, not very much in North America, I'm sorry to say.
Sounds like North America is kind of a fortress, defending itself against intelligent information.
Yeah, it's always been kind of and especially information that's outside of North America. It's very hard to crack. And I've been at some of these big meetings in other countries, and something with a Canadian focus has happened, and I've offered it to, I'm here, you don't have to pay me to come, I'm at this meeting and this thing happened, do you want, 500 words for $200 and been turned down nearly every time. And even though years ago I used to write for these folks.
Must be like Canadian newspapers and that kind of thing.
Toronto Star.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, does this relate in a way to the format of that book? Because the book is really an unusual format for serious journalism on major issues. Much more visual, full of infographics and so forth. Is that, that's obviously a decision. Tell me about that decision.
Yeah, that was a decision between myself and the publisher as a way to convey information in a more visual manner, because I think all of us are becoming much more visually orientated because of the online. And you can, I think, create a better, rather than using numbers, if you can actually picture the number of bottles of water it takes to make, let's say, a chocolate bar, for instance. So you can see, if I said, whatever this number is, 1,200 liters.
1,700. 1,700 liters, yeah.
That, it's much more, I think, powerful and more memorable to see it in this format. And so this format has really received a lot of attention. Teachers love it. I mean, gee, it's one of the big teaching tools now on water issues, which is fabulous. From my perspective as a writer, it's a bit more of a challenge, I got to say, because I had to, be a lot more concise, and rather than using metaphors, use images. I mean, it really is something similar that we writers do, is how can we express complex information in a simple way, and metaphor is often very helpful. In this case, the images work quite well for that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost like a kind of a convergence of the techniques of television and online stuff, and then with print.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's become, and even people of all ages have really responded to it. So it isn't just young people who think it's very attractive and appealing. I think it is part of the change, and I'm not, can't really, it is what it is in terms of what people are looking at. It's not easy to, it's not going to work for all materials and all subjects. Although, when I show my wife some of my stories that don't involve infographics, she says, there's too many numbers in there. And I like numbers, so it's hard to take them out and find other ways.
Well, yeah, you're very comfortable with the scientific, with scientific explanations of things which are do involve numbers almost inevitably.
Yeah.
That's also got to be a fairly expensive book to produce.
I assume so. I mean, that's the publisher's side of the story, and yes, it's more expensive probably, but and yet the book's only $20, so it's not an expensive book to buy.
That is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I want to turn into one last little phase of this. Your next project, you said, is a project about societal values and norms, how they arise, who creates them, how they're propagated, and how these influence how we think and what we do.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about that project. How are you going to do that?
Oh, well, I'm still working on how to do that. Although, I have to say, it looks like it's going to be in an autobiography form, much to my shock and horror. Yeah, because part of what my thinking now is, how did we get ourselves into this mess? What is it within our society that prevents us from doing what seems to be pretty obvious, prevents us from, what is stopping us from continuing to do destructive things? What's preventing us from, for instance, continuing to pollute the atmosphere with CO2? It's not a technical problem at all. I've written many, many stories about how it can be done. And, for 10 years at least now, we've known how to move away from fossil fuels, but we're not doing it. We're not doing it fast enough, so why not? What's going on here? What are the social pressures? I think it comes down to some of the values that we have presently. again, why are we electing leaders who know nothing about how the planet works? So it's more of that kind of answer some of those questions that I have myself about how did we get into this mess.
I'm curious, when you mention that one about electing leaders, you know, my wife often says, don't these guys have children? Don't they care about their kids? And you've got to believe it's really profoundly perverse for them to take the policies that they do, as with the media owners.
Yeah. Well, we're quite capable of talking ourselves into anything. I think that's the issue. We are a very flexible species, to our own detriment often. And so we can deny the truth about many things for a long time. And it's often not until our lives are less busy, usually when we're retired or towards the end where we go, ooh, oh, it's not going to be very good. Because we have time to reflect and think back and then think more long term. But we are quite capable of talking ourselves into doing really bad things.
One of our interviews not too long ago was with Alberto Acosta, the energy minister, former energy minister of Ecuador, who kept referring to the economía de la muerte and la economía de la vida. I've forgotten the word for life in Spanish, but the economy of life and the economy of death. Mm-hmm. And I found myself thinking, what would cause someone to work ardently and effectively in the service of death? Because that really is what ultimately boils down to, right?
Yeah, and the delusion is, you know, pretty powerful. We're capable, in the busyness of our of our lives, especially as an important, quote unquote, important person, we're kept too busy to think often and don't want to think about, you know, the consequences of our actions. And, you know, we're, as I say, capable of deluding ourselves that, oh, it won't be so bad, not really my fault, I can maybe do a little bit, you know, within the system to improve things, and you know, and sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. But there's a denial, essentially, behind a lot of the reasons why we continue to proceed off the edge of a cliff when it's getting pretty clear that that is what's going to happen.
I wanted to go back to the question of the autobiography and how that worked, because that's a fascinating response to that. And what makes you think that what moves you in that direction as a way of telling that story?
It's not out of any particular willingness. It seems to be the only way I can approach this material. And I'm being channeled by my own, I guess, internal need to go back in the past and understand my own personal past to be able to see the way forward for myself. And I guess in a way I've gone through this big transition from life in the corporate sector as a marketing director to this 20-odd years now as an environmental writer. So it's a transition too. And so where do I go from here? I'm not entirely sure. So I think this is part of my way of figuring out where I go, but also where we go and, you know, how we got here. So I see these things as intertwined. I guess my life in a way is kind of in a parallel, or maybe a metaphor for where we are and where we've been, and maybe I'll have some ideas about where we need to go.
I've often said that one of my own great strengths as a journalist is that is my ordinariness. That in a sense, if I can understand what's going on with me, I'll understand. And if I see something and want to write about it, very often other people will respond and they'll say, "I've been feeling that too, but I didn't." Right? Yeah. And so, in a sense, maybe we are kind of like not so much the antennae, but as the articulators, as citizens ourselves of what the citizens are thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I mean, when I was running for as an MP for the Green Party a few years ago, there was tons of people who would whisper in my ear, you know, "I really like your guys' policy. I think they're just fabulous, but, you know, I can't really vote for you." So we called them the closet Greens. And there are many people, because people know things are not right in what's happening on the planet. They know the weather is all out of whack, and it's getting worse, and they understand why this is happening. And that, and some of the causes, but nobody's really sure about what to do about it. So yeah, I think there's an important role for communicators to say, yeah, I'm feeling the same way. I went through this sort of figuring it out, and I think this is what I think is, where we are, and here's where I think we should go and how to do it. Because we need to have those conversations, get that discussion going. We have to also be able to imagine the future in order to get there. So we also need a lot of creative folks, in the arts, in film and novels, to also help us manage this transition by envisioning alternative futures and not just dystopia futures. We've got too many of those. We need some positive futures as well.
I think this is going to be a fascinating book, and I do, because I think it's you're uniquely positioned to write it too. But I think it also brings together. It breaks down the whole idea of objective journalism, in a sense. It says, no, we are all individual consciousnesses, and I may try to be objective, and I'll certainly try to be honest, fair, and accurate, but I do have a position, and I've been put in this position by the events of my life, and to really understand what I think is important, you kind of have to understand the place I'm standing, right?
Yeah, it seems to be what has to happen now for me. As I say, I've resisted it for at least 2 years, but now I'm committed to working on it.
I can see it as being a fascinating book about the evolution of consciousness, really.
Yeah, and it's a bit scary to dig deep into your own self on that. And when I'm used to being the outside observer, as you know, as a journalist, we often stand on the outside and observe things and comment on others. But to actually open yourself up is going to be a challenge.
Stephen Leahy, author of Your Water Footprint and creator of community-supported environmental journalism. If you enjoyed this interview, you may want to look at our interview with Maud Barlow, chair of the Council of Canadians, a water warrior who shepherded a right-to-water measure through the United Nations and who's written a trio of books on the looming world crisis in water. I'd also suggest our interview with Dr. Bill Rees, whose research gave us the original concept of an ecological footprint to measure with some precision our impact on the planet that gives us life. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for joining us.